You might not believe it right away, but there are moments in life that lead you down paths so unlikely they seem written by invisible hands. It was a gray afternoon when you, still wondering how to move forward, stumbled upon an almost absurd offer. An old cabin, forgotten in the middle of nowhere, sold for mere pennies. A recent widow, a mother, and with your soul still aching, you hesitated. But something inside you, a quiet strength, made the decision. The road there was narrow, made of dirt and fallen leaves. With each mile, you wondered if this was truly wise. Who buys a deserted cabin at the edge of the world, without even knowing if it's still standing? But there was something in that promise of a new beginning. Something in that isolation that felt more like refuge than abandonment. When your eyes saw it for the first time, your heart went quiet. It stood there shy, with splintered wood and a slanted roof. But even so, it held a kind of dignity. Like someone who had fallen but refused to stay down. You felt that the cabin spoke to you. That it carried wounds similar to your own. With the keys still cold in your hand, you pushed the door open. It creaked like it hadn't moved in years. The smell was of mold, time, and forgotten stories. There was dust on the furniture, cobwebs in the corners, and a sense that someone had once loved this place. You took a deep breath. It was little, but it was yours. In the first few days, the loneliness felt like a constant whisper. Your only companions were birdsong, the distant sound of snapping branches, and the creak of old wood beneath your feet. But there was peace too. And for the first time in a long while, you slept without thinking about all you had lost. It wasn't easy. Nothing was. You cleaned every inch of that place with your own hands. Replaced roof tiles, scrubbed windows, cried in front of the rusted stove. But each tear seemed to wash not only the cabin but also parts of yourself that had been forgotten. It was as if restoring that space helped restore you. Over time, small things began to change. Sunlight streamed more clearly through the windows. The smell of coffee replaced the mold. And your son, though still quiet, began to smile more. His eyes followed you curiously, as if he saw a woman he didn't quite know, stronger, more alive. It was on a rainy afternoon, while cleaning the floor of the old back room, that you noticed something odd.
A different kind of crack, like an echo beneath the floorboards. Curious, you knelt and gently touched the ground.
One board was loose. What lay beneath it would change everything.
Your hands trembled as you lifted the plank.
Wrapped in aged cloth was a box of iron. Heavy, covered in dust and time. You carried it to the kitchen, washed it gently, and with an old pocket knife, forced the small lock. The click of the iron giving way sounded almost like a sigh. Inside the box were notebooks, sepia-toned photographs, old coins, and what looked like a diary. The paper was yellowed but still readable. As you turned the pages, you began to discover the story of another woman.
Another mother. Another grief.
The cabin had been her home, and also her hiding place. The handwritten words spoke of love, loss, and secrets. Of how she hid there to protect something. Or someone. You read until your eyes burned. The woman seemed to write directly to you. Every sentence felt like a confession, as if she knew someone would one day find this. And understand. In the following days, you returned to the box again and again. You read the diary like it was a novel. But it was more than that. It was a mirror of feminine lives, woven through time. And the more you read, the more you realized, that woman had lost too. She had also started over, alone. She too had been judged by the town. You started to feel that the cabin had chosen you. Not by accident but by fate. As if that old floor had known you needed something that was just yours. That you needed a home that didn't demand appearances, only presence. And the cabin accepted you just as you were, tired, but full of love. The discovery of the diary became a secret between you and the silence. Each morning, before lighting the fire, you read a page. And each page lit something inside you. Strength. Clarity. A kind of courage that doesn't come from lack of fear, but from the decision to keep going despite it. One night, Your son asked if this would really be your new home. You looked at him, and for the first time since everything happened, you said, yes, without hesitation. Because there, among crooked walls and ancient memories, you found shelter.
A new beginning. And a story worth living.
Over time, you decided to share part of what you found with the town. You spoke to the local paper. Showed them the notebooks. But you didn't reveal everything. Some things are too sacred to spread. Even so, the news spread quickly. The town, curious, was left in shock. They never imagined that the old cabin held so much, or that someone would have the courage to restore it. People began to visit, some out of curiosity, others out of respect. There was something magical there now, something born of the combination of past and hope. A woman from the neighborhood said she remembered the previous occupant, that they used to say she was crazy, that she talked to herself, wrote too much, and rarely went out. You smiled. Now you knew she wasn't crazy.
Just a woman with a heart too full for the ordinary world. You started planting flowers in the garden. Fixing the porch.
Every detail was done with care, as if tending to a piece of yourself. Your son began to help. And slowly, the two of you created a new nest.
Fragile and destronatonce. Sometimes, at night, you still heard the wind in the trees like an old whisper. You weren't afraid.
You felt accompanied, as if the soul of that woman still lived there. Not to haunt, but to keep you company. To share the home with someone who knew how to feel. You realized that grief doesn't go away. It transforms. And that there are wounds that never fully heal, but teach you to look at the world more tenderly. The cabin didn't fix everything, but it gave you space to breathe. And most of all, to continue. Many people look at you now and say you were brave. That you did something impossible. But you know you had no choice. That sometimes, courage is simply moving forward when everything inside you wants to stop. Today, when you look back, you don't just see the wounded woman who arrived there. You see the whole woman who rebuilt herself with her own hands. Who made something beautiful out of what seemed ruined.
Children in town like to hear the story of the enchanted cabin.
They say it holds secrets. You smile. Let them believe that. Because a part of you still believes in magic. In unlikely encounters. In choices made with the heart. And when someone asks if you do it all over again, you answer with your eyes. Because some things can't be explained. Only felt. And you felt it.
Deep inside.
That you were exactly where you were meant to be.
You still kept the diary. In a place used for you.
Sometimes, you write little notes beside the words of the woman from before.
As if your stories now walk together.
As if time doesn't separate, but stitches together the souls that recognize each other. The town, once indifferent, now respects you.
Admires you.
And most importantly, listens. Because you didn't just restore a forgotten cabin. You gave life to a memory. Turned it into shelter. And taught, without words, that it is possible to be reborn from silence. There are days you still cry.
Not from sadness.
But from gratitude. Because, against all odds, against all the voices that said it was madness, you chose to believe. And somehow, the universe answered. If you could leave a message for anyone walking a broken road, it would be simple. Don't ignore the call. Sometimes healing lives in the most unlikely places. Sometimes all you need is the courage to open a door that creaks. The cabin was deserted, yes. But it was never empty. It was just waiting for someone who could listen. And you listened. Now, when you look in the mirror, you no longer see just a wounded woman.
You see a whole woman. With scars, yes.
But also with roots. And wings you once thought you had lost.
This is your story.
Not perfect, but profoundly true. And in some way, it was her story too. Because certain destinies cross long before they're lived. And if the town was left speechless by your discovery, it's because in the face of a woman's quiet courage to begin again, the only thing the world can do, is admire in silence. You never expected your life to realign itself between old floorboards and faded memories. And yet, something pulled you out of bed each morning, not out of duty, but because of a quiet, inner pull. Something was calling you. Something wanted to be found. Again and again, you returned to the back room. The place where the diary had been, where everything had changed. You felt there was still more hidden, not just beneath the floor, but in the air, in the walls, in the shadows of the past.
One foggy morning, your son found a strange oak on the wall. Unremarkable, almost like a forgotten nail.
But when you pulled it, a narrow crack opened.
A hidden passage. Behind the wooden wall.
The corridor was narrow and smelled of earth and old stone. You made your way forward with flashlights.
The path led downward, as if carved into the hillside. With every step, your heart beat faster.
Not from fear, but from anticipation.
At the bottom, you found a small room, barely larger than a closet.
In the corner stood a table. On it, old papers, rolled up and yellowed.
A candle, half-way melted.
And next to it, a letter with your name on it.
You couldn't believe your eyes.
Your name.
Handwritten.
But it was impossible. The letter looked decades old. With trembling fingers, you opened it. The words were clear, direct, full of feeling. And you felt like someone truly knew you. If you're reading this, it said, then you've found the path. Maybe because you're meant to. Maybe because you're ready to see what others never saw. You froze.
Your breath caught.
Who was this woman? And how could she be speaking to you? You began researching.
Names from the diary. Places. Dates.
At the town library, in old archives, even at the registrar's office. Piece by piece, you assembled a puzzle that had long been forgotten, or purposefully buried. It turned out that the woman from the diary had once been a healer. Someone who sought refuge in the middle of war. And who healed, not just bodies. She wrote about women on the run. About children she hid. About stories never told. And suddenly, you knew. This cabin wasn't a coincidence. It was a place of passage. For her. For you. Maybe for many others whose traces had long since been washed away by the rain, yet whose voices still whispered between the beams.
The town knew nothing of this. Or chose not to.
Because some truths are uncomfortable. They raise questions where there had only been legends. And you felt yourself becoming a bearer of these forgotten stories. In an old drawer, you found a key.
Small. Brass.
With no clue as to where it belonged. But you couldn't let it go. It felt important.
Like a promise. For weeks, you carried it with you.
In your pocket, under your pillow, even in your hand as you slept. Until, almost by accident, you found the old chest in the attic.
Dust covered.
Locked.
And the lock, a perfect match.
Inside were letters. Hundreds. From women to women. From mothers to daughters.
From sisters, friends, strangers. Letters full of care, doubt, hope.
You could hardly breathe.
So many voices.
So much pain, and yet so much love. You read them every night.
One after the other.
Some handwritten, others on the backs of old photographs.
Many without a sender.
And yet, they felt like your own story. As if you were part of an invisible web of souls. One woman wrote, I don't know if you'll ever read my words, but I write because I must. Because otherwise my heart will tear. And you felt, that's why you were here. To make these voices heard again. The cabin quietly became a temple. Not in a religious sense. But as a place of remembrance. You began small rituals.
Every Sunday, you lit a candle.
For all who came and left, without anyone ever speaking their names. Your son began to draw. Without being asked, he painted the rooms you now knew so well. But in his drawings, there was more.
Shadows.
Lights. Figures you couldn't quite recognize, but that felt familiar. One night, you dreamed of her.
The woman from the diary.
She sat on your porch, gazing at the forest.
You sat beside her.
And she simply said, "You've found it."
Now pass it on.
When you awoke, you knew. The cabin was not just your story. It was an archive of life. Of feminine courage. Of pain that had been transformed. And your task was not to forget.
You started documenting everything. Not for fame.
Not for public attention. But for truth. For those who would come after you. So they'd know they weren't alone. That others had fought, loved, and hoped before them. An old man from town spoke to you one day. "You remind me of her," he said. "The woman who disappeared back then. Everyone said she was mad. But I think she was just ahead of her time." Those words stayed with you. Maybe that's exactly it. Some women live out of sync with their time. They see, feel, understand things others only recognize later. And in their solitude lies a strength few understand.
The days grew shorter, the winds sharper.
But you no longer feared the cold. There was a fire inside you no season could extinguish. It burned for you, and for all who came before. Sometimes, you heard laughter. Not loud.
Used like an echo.
You wondered if it was memory or more. If perhaps the cabin itself was alive. Filled with everything it had ever witnessed. Your hands were rough from the work. But when you touched the walls, you knew each movement was healing. Not just wood, but history.
Trauma.
Hope. One day, a girl from the village came to visit.
Shy.
Curious. She asked, "Can I stay here? Just for a little while?" And you nodded. Because you knew, the cabin would find her too. You began to understand. The true discovery wasn't in the chest, nor in the hidden passage. It was within you. In your ability to feel, to listen, to preserve. And suddenly you wondered, how many places like this exist? How many cabins, caves, rooms, filled with forgotten voices, are still waiting for someone like you?
The questions within you grew deeper.
Not urgent, but quiet, like a wave rising slowly. What if this cabin was only the beginning? What if your steps were part of a greater path that had already been drawn long ago? You couldn't help but search every corner again. It felt like each speck of dust, each crack held a story. You moved with reverence, as if you were a guest in a living memory. One evening, your son found a framed photo behind a bookshelf. Faded, almost unrecognizable. But on the back a note, "So we never forget what was, and what we stood for."
No name.
Just those words. You started speaking with the elders in town. Those who barely left their homes anymore. Many looked at you as if they knew more, but said little. Yet in their eyes was a silent nod.
A kind of approval.
One old woman finally took your hand. "She was one of us," she said. But she was also different. She saw what others didn't want to. And she showed us how to live, despite everything. You were deeply moved. This woman, she had truly left traces. Not just in the cabin, but in hearts.
In memories.
In lives secretly changed by her hands. The girls from the village began to visit more often. They wanted to listen, to read, to ask questions. And you knew, something was beginning. Not official, not loud, but real. One day, a girl placed a flower next to the chest.
Without a word.
You left everything just as it was. Nothing was polished, nothing repainted. Because you felt, authenticity was the language of these walls. And everything you did was to accompany, to preserve.
Not to control.
You started writing a new book. Your own. Not as an author, but as a keeper. You told what you found.
What you felt.
What could never be proven, but could never be forgotten.
Sometimes you lie awake at night, the window open.
And you thought you heard footsteps, voices. Not frightening, more like a quiet welcome. As if they were grateful someone was finally listening again. Your dreams became clearer, longer. You were never alone in them. The woman was always there.
Sometimes by the fire.
Sometimes by the lake. Sometimes she sang. You couldn't understand the words, but your soul knew the melody. A letter in the chest mentioned an old trail through the forest. Only those who walk softly will find it. You and your son followed the clues.
No visible path. Only moss, roots, and silence.
But suddenly there was a circle of stones. Right in the forest. Perfectly laid, not by chance. In the center, a flat stone with a carved symbol.
A circle pierced by an arrow.
You recognized the symbol. It had been on one of the letters, barely noticeable. You began to suspect. This was more than history. It was a connection. Across time. Among women. In the city, no one wanted to hear of it. The archives stayed closed. People spoke of progress and modernization. But you knew, some truths don't fit into filing cabinets. One day your son asked, "Do you think she sees us?" You didn't hesitate. "I think she's here."
Not like a ghost.
More like a memory that lives on when we honor it. You made it a ritual. Every month, on the 7th day, you sat in the stone circle. Quiet. Without expectations. Just being. And every time, you left the forest lighter, more at peace. Once, you found a small fabric pouch in the circle. Filled with dried lavender, a crumpled drawing, and a note, "Thank you for preserving what belonged to us." You cried.
Not from sadness.
But from the feeling of being part of something.
An invisible circle, larger than yourself.
One that stretched across time and space. You began visiting other places. Old homes. Abandoned farms. Sometimes you felt it instantly. Something speaks here.
Something lives in secret.
Not every cabin was like yours. But each one carried traces.
Of life.
Of resistance. Of women who refused to break, even if no one celebrated them. You met a young woman who didn't know where she belonged. You invited her in, said nothing. And eventually she spoke. Of loss.
Of fear.
Of longing to belong. She stayed. For a day. Then a week. Eventually, she moved in. Not as a guest, but as part of a living story still unfolding.
Neighbors started bringing small things.
An old tablecloth. Homemade bread. A letter from their grandmother. The cabin became a heart. You needed no advertising. No website. No signs.
The women came.
Because they felt something was there. Something that understood their souls. And you.
You grew quieter.
Deeper. Not because you were tired, but because you had arrived. In a life that wasn't loud, but full of meaning.
One evening, your son found an oak. This time, beneath the porch.
He didn't call for you. He only smiled and said, "I think it's starting again." You knelt beside him, looked into his eyes. And you knew, this wasn't the end. It was another beginning.
A new chapter, waiting to be written.
You didn't open the hidden hook that night. Instead, you sat on the porch with a cup of tea, your son's head resting gently on your shoulder. The stars above felt unusually close, like witnesses waiting for what would come next. The air had shifted. Not colder, just expectant. As if something behind the veil of ordinary life was leaning forward, watching you. You felt it not in your skin, but in your bones.
A knowing without evidence.
In the morning, you opened the panel beneath the porch. It creaked softly, reluctant but willing. Inside, a leather pouch, old but intact. And inside that, maps. Hand-drawn, annotated, aged by time and fingers. They weren't just maps of land. There were circles and lines connecting places with symbols. Some you recognized from the stone circle in the forest. Others were unfamiliar. But they felt meaningful. Like a language you were born knowing, but never taught. One name stood out on the map. Ellingrot. It wasn't a place you'd heard of. You searched for it online, in local records, in town libraries. Nothing.
Not a single reference.
And yet, the name stayed in your head like a whisper. Your son kept pointing to the same spot on the map.
There, Edesay. That's where it begins again.
You didn't understand why he was so sure, but he had the same calm certainty you'd seen in the woman's letters. You decided to follow the map. You packed little. Intuition told you that what mattered couldn't be carried in bags.
Used stories.
Trust. And perhaps courage. As you drove toward the indicated area, the road narrowed. Trees grew thicker. The signal on your phone disappeared. Time slowed, or bent, or something stranger. You stopped in a clearing with no signage, no markings, except a single red thread tied to a branch. You knew that thread. It had been wrapped around one of the letters you'd found. You took it as a sign and walked forward, heart steady, breath quiet. Even the birds seemed to pause. The trail led to a cottage. Not abandoned, but weathered by age.
Ivy hugged the stone walls like memory.
You didn't knock. The door opened before your hand reached it.
A woman stood there.
Grey hair. Calm eyes.
Familiar.
But unknown. You've come far, she said simply.
And now you're ready.
She stepped aside, letting you in. It wasn't a question. It was a moment passed between women who understood something wordless. Inside, the cottage was full of warmth. Candles, books, plants, and a table covered with folded letters.
Not old ones.
Recent. All addressed. To the one who found the heart. You looked at the woman, but she only gestured to the chair. They've been writing, she said. All of them. The ones who remembered. The ones who refused to let it die. You opened a letter. It was from a girl in another country. She spoke of her grandmother's stories, about strength hidden in silence, about rooms beneath rooms, about light buried in shadow.
Letter after letter. You read. Women you'd never met, yet who knew you.
Not by name but by spirit. Each word was a thread in a larger web, and you were now in the center. The woman brought you tea and said nothing for a long while.
Then softly, Edingrad was never a place.
It's a name. A title. A legacy passed through those who dare to listen.
You felt your breath catch. Not fear. Recognition.
Am I her? You asked, unsure what you meant. She nodded.
No. You are you.
But you carry her path now. The cabin you bought for pennies had never just been a coincidence. It had been waiting. Not for any person, but for someone who could hear the stories in silence, who could hold the pain without needing to fix it. You stayed in the cottage for 2 days. Each night, the woman told you one piece of the tale. She never used dates.
Only feelings.
Moments. Symbols. Truth, she said, is felt, not measured. When you returned to your cabin, everything looked the same. And yet, everything pulsed differently. As if the land now acknowledged you. As if you had crossed some invisible threshold. You began to write again. But this time, not only about the past. You wrote letters to the future. To girls not yet born. To women not yet ready. You tucked them into books, into tree hollows, into jars buried beneath moonlight. Others followed. Quietly, they arrived. Some alone. Some with questions.
None left empty.
They took seeds of story with them, planted in their own lives, blooming in unseen places. You became a node, not a destination. The cabin remained your home, but it also became a doorway. Between the forgotten and the found. Between what once was, and what still could be. On your birthday, the post brought you a small parcel.
No return address. Inside, a single key.
Wrapped in lace. No note. But somehow, you knew what it unlocked hadn't been built yet. You hung it near the fireplace, where it caught the morning light. Your son asked about it once.
What does it open?
You smiled. Whatever needs to open next. You began hearing songs in the wind again. Not melodies exactly. Rhythms.
Cadence. Language without words, humming through the trees, through your bones, through time.
Sometimes you felt their presence. The others.
Not ghosts, something deeper.
Like echoes of stories still being told. You would sit by the fire and whisper, "I'm listening." And the house would sigh. Women came to you now with their own stories. Not for advice. Not for answers. But for stillness.
For reflection.
For the kind of space where truth unfolds like a petal. Not torn, but invited.
The stone circle in the woods grew covered in moss again.
But you didn't clean it.
You let nature decide how to hold the memory.
Truth doesn't always need clarity. Sometimes, it just needs trust.
One evening, a girl left a feather on your porch. Black and white.
Striped like a boundary crossed. You didn't know what it meant, but you placed it above your bed. And dreamed vividly that night. In the dream, the woman stood at the edge of a sea. She was younger now. Laughing. "Keep going," she said. "The circle isn't closed yet." You awoke with a new idea. One not tied to land or letters.
A gathering.
Not an event.
Something gentler.
Women coming together, not to speak, but to be.
You planned nothing.
You simply lit candles, opened windows, and left the door ajar. That night, 3 women came. They brought no gifts.
Only stories.
And by morning, none of you were quite the same.
Your son, older now, panted the cabin.
Not to hide its age, but to honor it.
It chose a deep forest green.
"It feels like home," he said. You kissed his forehead. "It is." On certain nights, you saw shadows in the trees. Long dresses, windswept hair, eyes like embers. You didn't run. You nodded. And sometimes, you felt them nod back. You no longer needed to prove anything. Some truths live outside explanation. Some discoveries are not meant to shake towns, but to anchor souls. And this cabin, found for almost nothing, gave you everything. The seasons shifted slowly, and with them, so did you. Winter brought stillness, a kind of sacred hush over the land. Snow clung to the roof like a quiet blessing. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, guarding memories you hadn't yet discovered. Each morning, you lit a single candle before speaking a word. A habit you hadn't planned, but one that came naturally, as if it were inherited. A soft ritual, not to ask, but to thank.
For the silence, for the space, for the unseen hands guiding you.
You began leaving blank pages in places around the cabin. On the bookshelf, beside the chest, near the window. Slowly, they started returning filled.
Words, sketches, symbols.
You recognized none of the handwriting, but every message felt meant for you. Some were in languages you didn't speak, yet somehow understood. Others were drawings, spirals, keys, animals, doors.
Always doors.
As if someone or many someones were reminding you, this story is about entry, not escape. One evening, you found your son drawing in the dirt with a stick. "It's her house," he said. "But not here.
Somewhere else."
You looked closer. It was a structure shaped like a spiral. Not of this world, yet deeply familiar. You asked him where he'd seen it.
Estragd.
She showed me. In the dream where we were underwater. His voice carried no doubt. And neither did your heart. Whatever he saw, it belonged to this unfolding. You went to the well behind the cabin, one you'd never dared touch. That day, the rope lowered smoothly.
No cracks.
At the bottom, instead of water, there was a wooden box.
Dry. Untouched by time. Inside, a single glove. Handmade. Too small for you, too large for a child.
And a pressed violet, still fragrant.
Beneath it, etched into the wood, left behind, not forgotten. You held it like a vow.
The air grew warmer with spring, but the veil never lifted. The cabin remained what it was, a bridge between what is seen and what is felt, between the woman you were and the one who had always been waiting to return. Letters continued arriving, some by post, some left in doorways. You never asked who sent them.
You simply read.
And each one carried a piece of someone else's truth. Some were raw.
Some lyrical. Al necessari.
A woman arrived barefoot one night, dripping with rain. You offered her a towel and tea. She said, "I dreamed of this place before I knew it was real."
You said nothing.
Just smiled. Because you knew exactly what she meant. She stayed 3 days. Said little. But before she left, she handed you a book she'd written but never published. "Keep it," she said. "Or burn it. It just needed to be here." You placed it on the shelf with the others. Unlabeled. But never forgotten. You realized one afternoon that your cabin had no mirrors. You hadn't removed them. There had simply never been any. Yet you had never missed them. Everything that mattered was reflected in other ways. A child came with her mother one day, holding a feather and a stone. She didn't speak, but drew symbols in the dust. One resembled the carving you'd seen in the forest circle. The girl pointed at your chest, then smiled, and left without a word. You began to hear music. Faint, drifting. Not from instruments, but from wind through old wood, from water in the gutters, from the hush of dusk. It was not composed, it was remembered. The chest near the window, once silent, now creaked open on its own. Inside, you found a notebook that hadn't been there before. Every page was blank, except the first, "Begin again." The town started asking questions. Quiet ones, whispered between market stands and under church steeples.
What's happening up there?
Why are they going?
Do you think she's starting something dangerous?
You didn't answer. You weren't building anything. You were remembering. And memory, for those who fear the past, always feels like rebellion. One woman came with doubt in her eyes. She said, "I don't believe in these things." You offered her tea anyway. She returned 3 weeks later, holding an old photo of her grandmother. "She lived in this cabin once," she whispered. You wrote that night, furiously. Not your story, but hers. The grandmother's. You didn't need all the details.
You had the feeling.
That was enough to make her live again on the page.
Someone left a small golden bell on the windowsill.
No note. No explanation. You placed it by the door.
It never rang.
But one morning, it was gone. And in its place, a small circle of salt. You told no one.
Some things belonged only to the night.
To the invisible pact between those who came before and those still learning to listen. Rain came often now, but it no longer soaked you in sorrow. It washed. It baptized. It reminded you that even decay had purpose. You let the ivy grow unchecked.
The wildflowers return.
Nature was a better architect than any man. A fox appeared outside your cabin every dusk. You left it pieces of apple. It never approached. But once, it left you a smooth bone on your doorstep. Offering, or omen, you weren't sure. But you kept it.
You painted the inside of the door one day.
Not with color, but symbols. You didn't plan them. Your hand moved with certainty, like it remembered a map too old for words. The dreams became brighter.
Not louder, just clearer.
You now walked alongside others in them. Women, young and old. Some wore veils. Others carried bowls of fire. All of them moved toward something unseen, unspoken. One of them, eyes like thunder, turned to you once. "When they ask who you are," she said, "tell them this: I am the place where memory speaks." You awoke with that sentence echoing through your chest. You carved it into the underside of the porch. No one would see it, but some would feel it. The girl with the feather returned. Older now. Confident. "I brought them," she said. Behind her, 7 others.
All different, all radiant.
They need to remember too. You opened the door wider. You stopped counting the visits, the gifts, the dreams. Not because they didn't matter, but because numbers belong to logic, and this belonged to soul. Your son, now almost grown, asked one morning, "Will I take care of this place someday?" You looked into his eyes. "Only if it calls you. No one owns this. We just protect what was never ours." And so the days rolled on. Uneventful to the untrained eye. Sacred to those who had learned how to see. You didn't search for more. Because more kept arriving.
One night, the wind blew open every window.
And with it came 1,000 petals. Red, white, violet. You didn't close the windows.
You let the night breathe the cabin in.
You fell asleep in the petals, heart wide open.
And in your dream, the woman from the beginning sat at your table once more.
She smiled and said, "Now, you're ready for what comes after." Folded hands, thank you so much for watching this story. If it touched your heart, please let us know you received this message by writing in the comments. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Speech balloon.
Chincheta, your support means everything.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could inspire your life. Open book, stay tuned. More powerful tales are coming in our Behind Closed Doors series. Each video brings you closer to hidden truths, emotional journeys, and uplifting moments you won't want to miss.
Destellos, remember, you are not alone. And together, we are stronger.
See you in the next Behind Closed Doors episode.